Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How do a violation of workers' rights, unsafe working conditions, and high unemployment rates, especially among youth, impact tens of millions of people around the world? What is one United Nations agency, namely the International Labor Organization, doing to help focus attention on these problems and hopefully to resolve some of them? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at workers' rights, unsafe working conditions, and high unemployment rates, especially among youth. And of course, these are some major problems affecting tens of millions of people around the world. My guest today is very knowledgeable of these particular problems. My guest today is Mr. Kevin Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy is Senior Communications and External Relations Manager for the International Labor Organization Office for the United Nations. Kevin Cassidy, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Kevin, let's start off. We do this. We could do a program every week. There's so much going on in the labor area as we'll get into in just a moment. But let's talk a little bit about the ILO, the International Labor Organization. It's over 100 years old now. It's the third oldest specialized agency in the United Nations family, UN system. What is the ILO and what does it do?
Right. The International Labor Organization is actually about people. I think when people hear the term labor, they think of someone who's digging a ditch or doing manual labor. But all of us in our capacity, whether we're lawyers or whether we're engineers or whether we are working in a restaurant or so, we are all workers. We're trading off our skills, our energy, our and knowledge for a remuneration. So we want to make sure that people in the workplace are receiving adequate compensation for their time, for their energies. We want to ensure that not only are people being paid well, but also that the quality of those jobs are good quality jobs. We've seen a lot of up and downs in the job market lately. The crisis in 2007 has created lots of problems. So the ILO is there to ensure that these shocks actually can be mitigated so that people have the dignity in the workplace and that the economic and the social development moves forward together.
Now, if we think back over 100 years ago, labor, governments, and businesses were obviously much different than they are today. You hear a lot of discussion at the United Nations about, is the UN still relevant? Are the agencies adapting to the 21st century and a globalized economy? Has ILO started to do that? Or they have been doing it for years and years and adjusting to it?
I believe so. I mean, when we're talking about work, as I say, we're talking about people. Whether that job is working in a high-tech industry or whether it's working in a sort of manual labor capacity, the world of work has changed in the details of the work itself, but I think the relevance of people in the workplace today are just as valid as it was 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. Now, what has changed dramatically in the last few decades is this new stage of globalization. I mean, globalization has been around in many different phases in time immemorial, just as the first traders embark on the seas to trade their goods with other countries. But what we see today is we see this very high-powered trading going on, whether it's in the financial services or whether it is these highly mechanized processes in building television sets or computers in Asia, shipping them to the United States or to Europe, the people who are working on the docks to transfer those containers, the people who are driving those boxes to the outlet stores, the people who are buying online, the people who are marketing those products. So this whole world of work is well integrated, more than it ever has been before. And we have to ensure that everyone, and not only the people at the high end of the market, but people who are suffering in the informal economy, people who are working in the fields and growing the corn and growing and picking the cocoa beans for the chocolate that we eat and gathering the rare earth elements that we put into our high-tech elements, that they're all protected as well.
And you were talking about the globalized economy, and you mentioned Asia. And of course, we just so vividly remember that horrific accident that took place in late April of 2013 in Bangladesh, where the building collapsed. And the latest figure I saw was over 400 people had been killed and undoubtedly hundreds more injured. What is causing that? Is there a rush to go to cheap labor? Is there a rush not to inspect buildings to make sure that they're safe? Is there a desire for many companies to go overseas so they can improve the bottom line? What's contributing to this, and what can we do about it?
Obviously, that was a tragedy and something that we cannot countenance. I believe that there are many employers out there who want to do the right thing, but pulling out of a market and not engaging in that market because of what might be seen as bad PR, that's not the right response, because who suffers? It's the people who need that job, people who need to support their families and the economic development of those communities. So you have to work with those people on the ground to ensure that they have safe working conditions. And the ILO, the United Nations, works very closely with the national entities. You know, the ILO and the UN system, we are not supranational entities. We can't go in and insist that this happens, but we can bring, I think, a lot of moral persuasion to that. It's important because it's about people. We have to ensure that the labor standards are protected. We have to ensure that the work conditions are right. I think in that particular case, there was an engineer who went in just the day before the collapse and said the building is unsound. But in order to keep that just-in-time production, in order to meet those demands on those contracts, people are pushed to the limit. Now, there are a lot of questions on both sides of the table. The ILO has sent a high-level mission to Bangladesh. They're in the process of negotiating how we can put those standards in place. How do we improve the labor inspectorate? How do we ensure that those companies that are investing in those countries are doing so responsibly? I think we have to engage. We can't disengage ourselves because the international economy is too well integrated. So it does require a great deal of discussion and dialogue, not only with the people who own the factories, but those people who actually work there.
It's very, very important. And of course, Bangladesh has really done well in so many different areas, especially achieving some of the Millennium Development Goals. And Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. It's one of the largest countries in the world. And of course, they've done very well as far as reducing infant mortality rates and improving maternal mortality, or lowering maternal mortality rates. So they're making great progress in certain areas, but this is one area where they could certainly probably use a hand to improve their standards and to focus attention on future problems like this. Well, I mentioned unemployment among youth. This is a major problem, and it's becoming, I think, more of a problem. The ILO had a recent report, the Global Employment Trends on Youth. What was the global employment trends on youth?
What we found in the report, and this is an annual report that comes out, that from the peak in 2008 of the unemployment crisis, which we saw at 74 million young people out of work, there was a period of improvement in 2010, but unfortunately, with the recent slowdown of the recovery, we are right back where we were before. So there are effectively 73.4 million people, so 74 million people. And this situation is not going to change before 2016. Certainly in certain countries, things are going well. For example, in Asia, we see an uptick in employment and young people are getting jobs, but we see that mostly in the low-skilled jobs. For the advanced economies, we are seeing the hollowing out of the middle. There's a lot of these jobs that people would go into and stay in for life. Now, what's happening is not only are the salaries going down, but also the benefits are going away as well, too. So families can no longer rely upon one person in the family having that job. And if the people who are trying to retire do not have the benefits, do not have the pensions, do not have the money saved, and the young people who are looking for jobs can't get their first foot into the job market because people are staying longer in jobs, or those jobs are for lower skilled people, we have a problem. So what we have in the developed world is that we have overeducation and underemployment, and in other places we have undereducation and overemployment. So in the informal economy, for example, you may even find people who have bachelor's degrees, and they're crowding out those who have less skills. So we have a real problem right now in looking at the match of skills, and this is something that we have to really pay attention to. And how do we create that conducive environment to invest in the future? We see around the world the move towards austerity, the drumbeat of saying, the deficit goals, that we have to bring down the deficits, we have to cut the costs. But if you're not investing in your future, if you're not building those highways, if you're not investing in the electronics industry, if you're not giving the people those STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, how are you then going to prepare for the future jobs? So the skills match is not only just for today's jobs, but are we preparing people for the future jobs? And the young people disproportionately feel that burden. And just to give you an example, in advanced economies, it is 3 times more likely that a young person will be unemployed. But in other places like the Middle East, it is 5 times more likely that a young person will be unemployed. And this creates a big social disconnect. And then as we see social disconnects, as we're seeing in Spain, as we see in Greece, as we see in other countries, will spill over to the political sphere. So it really is something that we all must be engaged in.
Exactly. We've got a video of what one country, namely Egypt, is doing to deal with this problem. And of course, we could probably take 90% of all the countries around the world, and they're all dealing with it in some way, shape, or form. But let's go to the video, listen to it, and we'll come back and talk about it. Let's go to the video.
This is Cairo. It's much quieter now than it was at the beginning of the year, when hundreds of thousands of frustrated young Egyptians took to the streets. It was a revolution that toppled the government, and now, after the recent referendum, the way is clear for elections later in the year. But Egypt's underlying problems remain. 90% of jobless Egyptians are under 30 years of age. Dina El Mafti, executive director of the Injaz Training Center, is concerned.
Hundreds of thousands are graduating every year from the education system and from vocational schools. And over 700,000 of jobs have to be created every year to meet the intake of these graduates. And it's a tremendous challenge.
And this challenge will only get greater. Throughout the Arab world, it's estimated that 51 million new jobs will need to be created over the next 10 years.
Kevin, that really focuses attention on the tremendous challenge that they have. We're talking 90% of the people are young. How can we move forward in a more effective way to deal with this? Should we be looking at doing things like maybe creating some type of, obviously with schools, you have to focus on that, but talk about maybe what we can do to help train these young people to move into blue collar jobs or something like that, to work on infrastructure projects. What can we do to accelerate the program to take these people off the street and to help them become more productive?
It is, as you can see, a terrible time for a young person looking for a job today. Some of the policies that we are recommending, for example, it is, as I say, investing in the education, but it's doing an analysis of the labor market. What are the jobs that we're looking for and not every country is the same. For some countries, healthcare, the green economy, the transition to a low carbon economy is the way to go. Technologies, engineering. So there are a number of areas that we can start to look at. But also we must look at the basics. How do we build the infrastructure? How do we have a jobs program? How do we put people who have maybe medium skilled or low skilled, how do we put them back to work to build the highways, to build the infrastructures, to build the electrification grids? How do we move that development forward? Because development is about jobs. If you don't have a job to move forward, not only do the people themselves suffer, but the economies suffer themselves. Also looking at counter-cyclical policies. When people lose their jobs, how do we provide that safety net for them? Do they have unemployment insurance? In their old age, are there old age pensions for them? We have these discussions about Social Security and cutting back on Social Security. But if you do that, how do older people live into their twilight years? So there are a lot of issues that we have to look at that. Also, making financing available for small and medium scale enterprises.
Mm-hmm. Well, our viewers could go to www.ilo.org for more information, and I'm sure that many will. You mentioned austerity. This is something that's just been resounding around the world. We see where a lot of governments in Europe have cut back. There's starting to be a tremendous slowdown of the European economies. The United States is going through this right now. There's been quite a bit of cutting going on as far as sequestration program that's underway. Should we, at this point in time, given the weak economy, the global economy, should we not be investing more in infrastructure development, maybe thinking about big projects, grandiose projects like that came out with, for example, we could use the United States during the Great Depression back in the 30s, when you had the Civilian Conservation Corps, when you had the WPA, the Works Progress Administration Program. Should we not be thinking about doing this to rebuild our infrastructure and to help people become gainfully employed and not be cutting back at this point?
I think so, and I believe the ILO has been saying that for many years right now. If the private sector is not investing, who is the investor of the last resort? It is the government. Now, some people come down on the side that the government is the problem. Other people come down on the side that the government is the answer. And I think it's on the latter rather than the former. When there's no one to invest, the government must invest. They must do something. They can't just sit around and wait for things to happen. I believe that the government has a role to be played in making these investments, because if you're not investing in the future, you stagnate. So yes, having a jobs program is fantastic, developing labor-intensive industries. And I'll give you an example. When the tsunami had struck in Banda Aceh in Indonesia, it had wiped out major roads. And when the UN system went in, they looked at the major roads that were going in, the tarmac, and of course the World Bank and UNDP had put a lot of money into building those roads. But the ILO worked on a labor-intensive project building feeder roads, because it was from the villages in which the handicrafts were coming from. It was from the villages in which the goods were coming in. So by building those roads, by using macadam processes, by using simple processes that low-skilled and no-skilled people can do, instead of buying $1 million a day asphalting machine, you can actually put a lot of people to work. And then, of course, all the micro-enterprise that comes around that, by getting people to the job, by having food there, by selling water in those sites. So you can create a lot of economic opportunity by thinking smartly about the situation that you're in. There's not one size fits all. We need targeted programs, we need to understand the labor market problems there, and we need to make those investments, and we need to make them now.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'll be back in just a moment after this important message. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at unsafe working conditions, workers' rights, as well as high unemployment rates, especially among youth. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Kevin Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy is the Senior Communications and External Relations Manager of the International Labor Organization Office for the United Nations. Kevin, we're talking about just a myriad of issues that affect laborers and we're literally tens of millions and billions of people around the world. As we think of these problems, so many of them have been galvanized, I think, in the 8 Millennium Development Goals. We go back to 2000 when the United Nations adopted the 8 Millennium Development Goals, very logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women, to promote sustainable development. These were goals that the majority, in fact, all the countries of the world at the UN agreed to, and a large number of non-governmental organizations, businesses, individuals, faith-based groups, you name it, they've pretty much signed on to the achieving the Millennium Development Goals. How do you factor these in? You have a tripartite arrangement with the International Labor Organization. You have the labor component, you have the businesses, and you have the government. They all want to work together to some degree, but they all have different interests at times. How do you balance those, and how do you bring these 8 Millennium Development Goals in so that you can promote sustainable development and still not destroy the profit margin or the bottom line for a company? Or how can you empower women and not violate somebody else's creed or whatever it might be?
It's a very important question, and I think it all starts with dialogue. When you have governments, workers, and employers sitting at the table, as you indicate, not everyone has the same departure point and not always the same objectives as well. But when you bring those parties together and you are very clearly delineating how do you address these problems. So, for example, with the development of the Millennium Development Goals, jobs were not on the ticket. But through an analysis and through working with the UN, we realized that through reducing poverty, jobs is a wonderful way to do that. When you empower people by allowing them to develop their skills, to employ their skills and give fully to society for a fair and living wage for themselves, they can actually then afford better nutrition. So you achieve that goal. They can afford education to achieve that goal. You can reduce mortality rates because there is better health care. So I think a lot of the outcomes can actually be benefited by having people have good jobs. So how do we get to that point? So the ILO has a very unique experience in mitigating between the desires of the workers and the employers' side, and we come to a rational middle ground on that. And I think that's something very instructive, because here at the UN, we're dealing mostly with the member states and their desires for development goals as set nationally. So how do we actually broaden that out? How do we bring the multi-stakeholders to the table? How do we negotiate? And we have a great deal of experience on how to do that. The ILO is a normative agency, but it's also a very practical agency in developing labor legislation. Nearly all labor legislation in the world today since 1985 has been aided in some way by the ILO, either directly or through its standards. So there is a role for the UN to play, and dialogue is at the heart of that.
There are so many groups around the world that are really faceless. They don't have representation. They're almost invisible to a large degree in the deliberations. I'm not saying with the ILO, but I'm talking about people who have fallen on hard circumstances. And one group that comes to mind is refugees. These people have suffered so much, and the majority of them had nothing to do in creating the problems that have driven them from their homes, uprooted them, destroyed their businesses, perhaps separated their families. I want to go to a clip that we'll look at for just a moment, and then I'd like to get your opinion on the refugee situation. I know you're not the UN High Commission for Refugees, but how this ties into the International Labor Organization, what you do. But let's go to the video, watch it, and we'll come back and talk about it.
UNHCR predicts that within the coming months, there could be some 1 million Syrian refugees crossing the borders, a growing crisis that calls for urgent support.
We've got the capacity, we've got the space, we've certainly got the willingness from a very generous government, generous people. But we need to put the money into the healthcare, into the education side, into the shelter, into the food, into the water. So we need that money now, so we're better prepared.
Suddenly, the border lights are shut down. A border guard climbs in a watchtower. There is a security threat. And yet, despite the darkness, the refugees keep coming.
Kevin, that shows, I think, it's just one country, Syria. We could have gone to 10 or 12, 15 different countries because there's so many refugees that are moving in all directions. And of course, it's been estimated, I think, that right now, this year, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and other groups are working with over 35 million refugees who have been forced to flee their homes just to stay alive. How would we put that human face on these refugees, and how does that tie into what the ILO is doing or what it can do to provide, not to provide assistance directly, but in your activities?
Well, these are multiple problems that we see. People who are leaving their home, people who are living out of tents. You look at the faces of those people. I mean, how are they going to start life again? Some of that starts through having a shelter. Some of that starts through having food, to be able to rely upon that, education. So the UN is a distributed system that provides a lot of assistance, whether it's through UNICEF or whether it's through IOM or the High Commissioner for Refugees. What the ILO looks at is the human capacity and the human suffering. How do you actually get people out of those environments? The economic reintegration of people. We deal with this in migration. We deal with this with child soldiers. So the techniques that we use can be applied across a multiplicity of environments, and with refugees no different. How do you then take people and make them integrated into society again? How do they contribute more fully? How do they create worth for themselves and create dignity for them and the people around them who look up to them? So it's a really, really important question, and I think we're moving towards that goal.
Kevin, tell us your website again.
That's www.ilo.org.
.org. Okay. Now you have a very unique agency for many organization, I should say, for many reasons. In fact, it's the third oldest in the United Nations system, but also it's that tripartite arrangement that you have, and you bring in so many of the key players in this. How do you plan to build on this in the future? What do you hope to do with these three players to help them to focus attention on these problems and to work more closely to overcome them?
All right. I think the ILO is a perfect example about how to reach out to multi-stakeholders and bring them into the process. As I say, other UN agencies work with member states, very important, sovereign nations. I mean, they are the members of the organization. For the ILO, workers and employers sit on our governing body. They're the ones who help direct the agenda. For example, next year at our International Labor Conference, we'll be looking at the informal economy, a very, very important aspect of developing countries' growth. We're also looking at human trafficking, which we see in the larger debate of forced labor. So there are a lot of questions and a lot of issues that we're still facing that we need to bring in the multi-stakeholders. We need the business view. We need the individual view. We need the NGOs and the media. We need all this concert of voices coming together, and we need to have a process in which all of those very important perspectives can actually be reflected in our development goals. And the ILO has been participating in the post-2015 development agenda, and we are looking for how to put a human face on development. And that starts with focusing on people and people's livelihoods, and how not to just see the person as a commodity, because people are not commodities. They're not wood or steel. They have ambitions and desires and dreams. And around the world, people want to work to create better lives and better opportunities for themselves and for their children. People have a wonderful capacity to sacrifice their current status to ensure that their children have a better life for themselves. So I think it's important to start looking at how development is about people.
Well, these are very important issues, and of course we'll probably never forget the situation with Bangladesh, the unsafe working conditions, and many of the other problems with the workers' rights, just on across the board. But all of the players that you mentioned are so critical to helping to overcome these particular problems, and we have to work together. No one entity can do it by itself. The UN can't do it by itself, the business folks can't do it, the governments can't do it, but if we do focus attention on this and bring in all these key players, we can help achieve these goals. And of course, with the 8 Millennium Development Goals, they are so important, and unfortunately we didn't have time to talk about them, but there's the post-2015, which was the deadline for the 8 Millennium Development Goals, but they're not going to go away, they're not going to evaporate, but everybody will still be working on them, but they'll be under that sustainable development rubric. But Kevin Cassidy, these are very important issues, and I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.